our country is obviously in a rather volatile situation. In some conflicts, I think it can be virtuous to remain neutral. Not in this one, which isn't to say that it's a simple uh, black and white sort of a situation. There aren't just two fronts in this war. If it is spiraling into civil war, it's unlike uh, the Civil War in the 1860s in the sense that there's no front line. The front line are city streets, and while there is still a kind of rural or urban divide, and in many ways um, the Democratic, Republican, progressive, conservative divide is a function of geography and um, these ideologies, progressivism and conservatism, do really need certain environments, not just cultural environments, but geographical environments in order to take root and to thrive. So if there's a front in this war, it's kind of an urban-rural thing, but in the midst of these cities, there's also, and suburbs, there are police forces. And these police forces have become increasingly militarized, and they've always been in this country rooted in white supremacy, in the imposition of authority on black and brown bodies with a much higher degree of force than the way that authority is wielded in relationship to other white bodies. And some cops are black. It doesn't mean they're not caught up and trained within a system which enforces white supremacy. So it's not as simple as just skin color. It's, it's talking about modes of life here. And so we have a problem. We have a society set up to feed a certain sector of society into the police force, right, and into the military. And a lot of times these are damaged souls, and it's of no fault of their own, the socioeconomic circumstances within which people who tend to become cops or who tend to enlist in the military, these are the people who are able to like get themselves out of poverty, right? With a lifeline given to them by a recruiter that shows up when they're in high school to make something better of themselves, right? To serve their country, to serve and protect. And the problem is that a lot of times these people are wounded, and it's just one stereotype, and it's very oversimplified. I get it, but the picture seems to be that the school bullies, if they're able to avoid drug addiction and despair, at least overt despair, they can become cops, but they still have this mentality that makes them believe that other people should just listen to them and do what they say, and if they don't, they're outraged enough to take out a gun and shoot them. And obviously, I'm not trying to downplay the risk that is involved in policing, especially in the United States, where every other person has 3 guns. And in Europe, cops don't need to carry guns because most likely any perp they're going to encounter is not going to have one. In the United States, you can't say the same. There are guns everywhere. Certainly easier to get a gun, less expensive to get a gun than it is to get an education. Or to get a job now, so there's so many guns to go around. It's amazing. It's a miracle that there aren't more deaths at these protests already. So I don't downplay the risk that cops take. It's not just their fault that the United States is overrun by guns. But, so we need not just to retrain cops to de-escalate rather than to shoot at the first sign of trouble. We need to train them to de-escalate, but we also need to get guns off the street. And that very proposition just infuriates all the rural people who own guns as part of a cultural heritage, Maybe they're hunters, and even they're sport shooters, and this feels like like I'm reaching into their heart and trying to tear out what's most meaningful to them. And I don't personally like guns. I've fired several forms of gun, rifles and handguns, and I mean that 50 caliber Desert Eagle Israeli made machine was sublime, right? And I would never want to fire it again, but I get the rush of power that flows through you when you wield one of these weapons. I get why you would want to do it for sport, even while I don't really feel drawn to engage in that sport myself, and I certainly don't feel drawn to hunting for sport. I think, if it were a matter of life and death, I'm not necessarily vegan. I think that it can be ethical for humans to kill and eat animals. I think it can be. It's not under our industrial mode of production, where we have factory farming, the equivalent of an animal holocaust going on. That's not virtuous. That's not just or ethical. But I think there are other relationships that human beings have had in the past and can have in the present to eating animals. Other relationships to their ecology that involve eating one another that are still virtuous and ethical. I mean, life is, as Whitehead said, life is robbery, but the robber requires justification. So obviously the industrial mode of meat production is a moral catastrophe. But the point here I'm trying to make is that violence is so deeply woven into the very fabric of American identity. We're born in a revolutionary war as a nation, and then we die and are reborn in a civil war. Trying to, as as the European masters of this land, who took it from the Indians, tried to settle accounts with one another, because there were two factions, right? There were the northern industrialists and the southern plantation owners and slavers. And it's not like the North wasn't in some way morally culpable, as morally depraved as the southern slavers, because it was the northern industrialists that were funding, providing all the insurance policies and other monetary instruments to invest in the expansion of slavery across the South and Southwest, into the territories. As hundreds of thousands of slaves were marched west, right, as this country expanded into the western part of the continent, and they just marched slaves to create cotton fields and shipped. In 1860, 75% of the cotton being sent to the mills in London and Britain came from the United States, picked by slaves, by enslaved Africans. So, you have the southern part of the country going to war with the northern part, and the country tore itself apart over that. The North ends up winning the war and getting rid of chattel slavery, or reinstituting what's called wage slavery across the whole country. But the racism that's in the South and in the North hasn't gone away. It's still here. And it's not the only source of violence, but in America, it certainly seems to be the most pivotal form of violence that we're confronted by now. And it is reflected in our foreign policy. Our domestic racial tensions are not unrelated to our foreign interventions against brown people elsewhere on this planet whose lives don't matter. So we can't be neutral anymore. There's a legitimate fascist in the White House who just, fired poison gas at legitimate protesters in front of the White House for a photo op, so he could walk out there and hold a Bible instead of a burned church. he was asked by a reporter, "Is that your Bible, Mr. President?" And he's like, "It's a Bible. It's a Bible." I mean, I just feel like someone needs to take that video and frame it, contextualize it. It just speaks at so many levels to the depravity of American culture, so-called at this point, popular American culture. And I'm not trying to other it. I think we have the president that we deserve, and we couldn't gallop west towards the sun, ignoring our shadow forever. Eventually, destiny was going to catch up with us, and we were going to have to turn and face slavery, and the enslavement of Africans. We were going to have to turn and face the genocide, the extermination of Native Americans, and really examine ourselves as a culture and stop celebrating us. America always wins. That's Trump's answer to this moment. America always wins. We can't pretend that there isn't a fascist in the White House anymore. We can't pretend that Trump is not going to try to exploit this moment of civil unrest to impose martial law. He's being begged by some elements in the GOP to invoke his 1807 law or act, the Insurrection Act, right? So that the military can take control of American streets and arrest or kill civilians who resist. This is not a place that any of us should want to go. I'm not ever in favor of violence, whether, certainly not first strikes, but even the retaliation. Violence only seems to escalate. Violence begets violence. And the nonviolent path, I think, is, as many have argued, King and Gandhi among them, may actually be more effective in the long run. This doesn't mean I'm a pacifist, when I think if there's a real enemy like, the Nazis, well, the Allied powers had to coalesce to defeat that evil, that cancer, or it would continue to metastasize, right? So in some cases, war is necessary. I'm not a pacifist. But violence only begets more violence. The United States had to create the military-industrial complex to destroy Nazi Germany, and the United States had to create all of the intelligence agencies, the intelligence industry, the CIA, the NSA, and other agencies, in order to defeat communist, the Soviet Union. And so it's as though this country had to become more evil to defeat evil, and now we're stuck with these complexes that we've created, and violence is beget more violence, right? So what does that mean? What does peaceful protest or peaceful resistance look like in the face of militarized police forces and then the actual fucking military being deployed within the borders of this country? How do you peacefully resist that? I don't know if I have an answer to that question. I think we have to do it in a lot of ways. But ultimately, we don't have as many guns or helicopters or predator drones as they do. So no amount of handguns are going to help us resist the military invasion of our own country by our own military. We don't have enough firepower to resist that. So how do we resist? Well, we have these things. We have we have an information economy and a consciousness economy facilitated by these technologies that allows us to talk to one another in an unprecedentedly networked and interconnected way. But how do we use these media? I think peaceful resistance probably has a lot to do with art making, with what Joseph Beuys called social sculpture. Because ultimately, if we can't beat them through the exchange of force, if we can't coerce the militarized state into allowing democracy to flourish, if we can't coerce them, then we need to persuade them. And we need to persuade fellow Americans, 60% of whom are actually in favor now, I just saw the latest poll, of sending the military into our cities. We need to persuade our fellow Americans through art, through social sculpture, that Trump is a fascist, and there's another way to do this. That Black Lives Matter, and that everybody in this richest country in the history of the world has a right to healthcare and education and housing and food. That no one need go hungry. It's not even like this is a problem we can't solve. It's true. The capitalist economy has created so much wealth that we can actually feed and house and educate and heal everyone on the planet if we wanted to. The problem is, apparently we don't want to. We'd rather just let trillions of dollars get sucked up by a few hundred, billionaires, financial capitalists who run the world and run the transnational, sit on the boards of the transnational corporations that run the world, that own nation states, that dictate foreign policy and pandemic policy, it would appear. I think we have to convince our fellow Americans that we don't have to put up with that shit, and that there shouldn't be poor people. Why are there classes? Why do we allow for poverty to exist when there are multi-billionaires who look at the difference between a million and a billion? Just look at some of the visualizations that are out there. It's more than you think. So we're in crisis. There's so many facets to it, but bottom line is we can't remain neutral. I don't like the Democrats, but politically, I don't even think the federal government is going to be the source of any of the solutions to our actual problems as a species right now. But that federal government still wields the power of the U.S. military. And that thing is a beast that I do not want to have to reckon with. And so if we have Democrats in control of that, we're less likely to have martial law declared. If we have not only Republicans, but a fascist iteration of, the Republican family of political ideologies, if it's Donald Trump in charge of that military behemoth, we're in for a bloody, catastrophic phase of our national history. So I don't want to invite that. And I think even if electoral politics is ultimately not going to solve our problems, it's at least going to make our problems less bad. So I do encourage people to vote for whoever is running against Donald Trump, nominated by the Democrats, whether that's Biden or someone else. But again, voting is just one small piece of this, and I think really we should be finding ways of communicating and contacting our fellow Americans. Reach out through your family networks and your friend networks and talk to people who don't think like you do, who have been supporting Trump, and try to connect with them around the violence of our society and whether the best way to move forward is more violence or whether the best way is actually love. And that sounds so Pollyanna or something. But love is, it's related to the power of persuasion, I think. And ultimately, if evolution means anything, It's about the gradual growth away from power as coercion and force to power as persuasion and love. And if that's not what evolution is, if that's not what this is all about, then I don't know what's real. So, happy to hear your thoughts and responses, and I'll try to engage as much as I can. Thanks.